Those beautiful words of the poet Mary Oliver, where she asks all of us the question, what are you going to do with your one wild and beautiful life? I think that's the question that spiritual direction invites us to consider again and again. In the midst of all of the obligations we have, the roles we have to fulfill, the expectations society and all kinds of people put on us. So often that essential question is obscured. What do you want to do with your one wild and beautiful life? And I think spiritual direction helps all of us to listen to that question, to ponder it deeply, and to try to answer it. A metaphor I like very much, I think, is expressed well by a poem by the 14th century Persian mystic Hafiz. And this has a lot of images, I think, that speak very much to what happens in spiritual direction. The title of the poem is, We Should Talk About This Problem. And I like to look at it as it's God who's speaking. So God says, there is a beautiful creature living in a hole you have dug. So at night I set out fruits and grains and little pots of milk and wine beside your soft earthen mounds. And often I sing, but still, my dear, you do not come out. I have fallen in love with someone who hides inside you. We should talk about this problem. Otherwise, I will never leave you alone. So that poem has, I think, very, very beautiful and evocative images about human life and what spiritual direction can do to enhance our lives. Inside each one of us there is a beautiful creature living in a hole that we have dug. Often we're not in touch with our own beauty, our own holiness, our own sacredness. And the holy or God or the divine is constantly setting these things in our life, setting these things in our experience to allure us to pay attention to that. Often I begin by saying what it's not. And the two things that it's not, in my point of view, are spiritual or direction. I say spiritual direction is not spiritual in the sense that it merely deals with spiritual things. And indeed, I find the things that people most bring to spiritual direction are very physical, very daily, relationships, work, concerns about the state of the world that they're in. Rarely, in my experience, does spiritual direction limit itself to things that look like stained glass or smell like incense. And it's also not direction in the sense that I am leading the person anywhere. I'm very conscious that a power, a presence far beyond either of us is the one who's doing the leading. And indeed, I don't even think that God is much into leading or into control or into direction. Most people, you say prayer, and immediately they think of something I'm not very good at. I do a lot of retreat work with it's often elderly women, nuns in Catholic religious communities. And I'm struck by the fact that these people who have given 50, 60, 70, 80 years of a life to God think that they're lousy at prayer. And they're very upset that they fall asleep and things like that. So prayer, for so many people, has the savor of duty, of obligation, of something I know I'm not going to be good at, that I'm never going to get right. Whereas I think for me, to use, again, kind of a classic definition of contemplation that comes from the great Carmelite spiritual writer William McNamara, who said, contemplation is taking a long, loving look at the real. So whatever is real in our lives, and again, as I said, it's not things often that smell of incense or look like stained glass windows. Our best relationships, the truest things that we're involved in, looking at them deeply and lovingly is an act of prayer. I often invite people, for example, to think of the time in their life when they most experience joy. And when your breath was absolutely taken away by some experience, by seeing the Grand Canyon, by looking at your newborn child for the first time. Nobody has to tell you to be joyful. Nobody has to tell you to be filled with awe. There's no sense of obligation about it at all. Those experiences are much more like prayer, or what contemplation is like, than by this grim, determined, on my knees, trying to get God to pay attention, as if God hasn't been infinitely attentive to us all the time. So I think helping people to get in touch with the things that really engage them in that way, and seeing prayer as more like that, contemplation as more like that, than the things that they find so frustrating. I think an energy for caring about the world or for action in the world that isn't rooted in contemplation is fundamentally false and dangerous. Because in prayer, in contemplation, we become in touch with the forces inside ourselves, the tendencies inside of ourselves that manifest themselves in what's broken in our world. The brokenness in our world comes from, in large measure, the brokenness inside ourselves. So doing good from a motive of seeking power or self-aggrandizing or all those kind of things that bat around in the human spirit are part of what's causing the brokenness in the world. So learning to be at peace with the multiple things that are batting around inside me is necessary for being a force of peace in the world. Being attentive to others, being attentive to the world, to the needs of the world. We can't do that unless it's coming from a deep place in us. In my experience, sometimes it's far harder for people to fully plumb the depths of their joys rather than to find meaning in their sorrows. And again, I think sometimes that's more difficult. So I would say that certainly people come to spiritual direction for both things. Spiritual direction certainly can be very helpful for people in moments of crisis and in moments of transition. Because I think when we look at our own experiences of a terrible loss, the person who is the least helpful in our lives, I suspect, is somebody who comes up to you and says things like, "When God sends you lemons, make lemonade." People who have these very facile slogans that everything is going to be all right and that kind of stuff. That is definitely not a healing thing at that moment. What spiritual direction is best at is providing a vessel, providing a container in which whatever is going on inside someone can be held. And people in deep spaces of grief or loss, I think that's exactly what they need. To find another human being who will create in that relationship a vessel, a container, to hold whatever is going on in their lives. And those feelings very often are not pretty. Fortunately, spiritual direction is one relationship that has a long tradition of being able to do that. Simply companioning someone through the process of really experiencing the unspeakable losses that people go through in their lives. So both in times of loss and in times of great joy, in times of great celebration, spiritual direction is that kind of vessel, that kind of container that can hold something and allow us again to look at it long enough that its real meaning will be revealed to us.